Hi, everyone. Hi again this time now that the recording started. It's a beautiful day today, December 7th, and we have a new installment in the speaker series organized by the Department of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest in partnership with CELFIS. This is the Center for the Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and in partnership with FISCDI. This is the local state funding agency for research, and the project by which that is achieved is the PN-3 Roman-P1-1.1-BD-2019-0535. And we're very grateful to the Romanian state for providing all this research funding to all of us. And today is a special day because we have a special speaker with a special talk to deliver, and that is David Kovacs. David has a PhD in philosophy from Cornell University. And then, David, please correct me if I'm wrong. You spent a year at Boğaziçi. Is that correct?
Bilkent.
Bilkent. I always mix them up. I'm so sorry.
That's fine. Yeah.
And they're so important, both of them in European analytic philosophy. So I shouldn't mix them up. Now David is an assistant professor at Tel Aviv University.
Senior lecturer, but it's okay. Hard to translate these things. Yeah.
So let's give it a couple more months, and I'm sure that the happy thing is gonna occur. And I should say that before coming into philosophy, David also had a JD. So he has some background training in law, and that seems to have suited him just fine because this talk is going to be in analytic metaphysics. And it's a fantastic thing. I'm eager to hear how this is going to unfold. This is called Count Indeterminacy and the Problem of Vague Non-Objects. David, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us, and take it away.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be here, even if only virtually. And thank you so much, Andrei, for this warm introduction. So, as I said, and as Andrei noted, this is a talk in very old school, humorless metaphysics. I'm hoping to make it as accessible as I can, but if I'm obviously happy to take questions at the end, but I'm also going to stop at least after the setup to see if people are on board or we need to go over something again. So if something's not clear, please do stop me. That's totally fine. So the thesis that, and I hope people are seeing my screen now, in large screen.
Yep, we're seeing it.
Okay. Okay, great. So the thesis that I'm going to focus on is called Universalism. Metaphysicians call it Universalism. That's the view that necessarily for any axis, there is a y that the axis compose. So just to give you some examples, universalism is an answer to the so-called special composition question. A special composition question asks, what are the conditions under which some objects compose a further object? And there are all sorts of possible answers to this when they are stuck together, when they participate in a life or in some homeostatic event. But one of the simplest answers is the universalist answer. It says that composition just always happens automatically, as it were. So for example, the particles in my laptop compose a laptop. The particles in my foods compose a foods. But there are also all sorts of weird, arbitrary mereological fusions, such as the fusion of the laptop and the food, and the fusion of my right ear and all of the cola bottles in the world, and the fusion of the British Islands with the Uranus, and all sorts of weird things. So absolutely any collection of objects in any arbitrary arrangement compose something. So this is obviously a somewhat weird-looking, counterintuitive view. So there isn't really a reason to accept it without argument. And one of the most popular and widely discussed arguments for universalism is the so-called Lewis-Sider argument from vagueness. The first place where this argument is presented is in a few paragraphs in Lewis's The Plurality of Words, and later on Ted Sider presented a much more developed, more sophisticated version in four-dimensionalism. So it's come to be known as the Lewis-Sider argument from vagueness. So here's how the argument goes. And first, so there are lots of ways to present this argument. The presentation that I'm going to give is going to be a lot less technical than what's common in the literature. The reason is really the level of grain, and the amount of technical machinery that's used to present this argument. That largely depends on which part of the argument you want to focus on. So I deliberately simplified steps in the argument that I don't want to deal with today. I'm only going to focus on one particular step in this argument, and the rest I only present here in large brushstrokes. You could have 17 premises here instead of 4, but I think this version will do for my purposes today. So here's how the argument goes briefly, and I'm going to go over these premises more slowly in a moment. So first, if universalism is false, then there can be either a borderline case, either there can be borderline cases of composition, or a sharp cutoff with respect to composition. The second premise says if there can be borderline cases of composition, then there can be count indeterminacy. That means it can be indeterminate how many things there are. The third premise says there cannot be count indeterminacy. It cannot be indeterminate how many things in the word there are, or how many concrete things. I'm going to get back to this in a moment. The fourth premise says that there also cannot be a sharp cutoff with respect to composition. And the conclusion of the argument by modus tollens is that universalism is therefore true. So let's look at the premises of this argument. So just to forecast a little bit what's going to happen, all of these premises are controversial, but most of these premises I'm not going to take an issue with. So I'm just going to lay them out now. So let's look at the first scenario. If universalism is false, then there can be either borderline cases of composition or a sharp cutoff with respect to composition. So what would it be like if universalism were false? The idea is that if universalism is false, then sometimes composition happens, but not always. So there are conditions under which certain things compose a further object, but there are also conditions under which they don't. So to see the rationale behind the first premise, we are asked, at least this is the way of Sider to set things up, we are asked to imagine what he calls a sorites series of composition. So a sorites series of composition is basically a series in which any two adjacent members are extremely similar. We begin with a clear case of composition, and we end with a clear case of non-composition. So what I put up here is just one way to visualize that. So first imagine a scenario in which you have two things that determinately compose something. Whatever condition you think they need to satisfy, just imagine that they very clearly satisfy it. So For example, if you think they need to be stuck together, imagine that they are very closely stuck together. So, for example, the handle and the head of a hammer. Imagine that they are stuck together, glued together as clearly and obviously as possible. Then in the adjacent case, they are stuck together just a little bit less. You know, just to be clear, stuck together is just one example. So you can replace that with any condition that you think composition depends on. Then in the third scenario, they are stuck together or satisfy whatever relevant condition there is, just a little bit less clearly. And in the last step of this sorites series, we have a pair of objects that very clearly and determinately don't satisfy whatever it takes for two objects or more objects to compose something. So this is what a sorites series of composition is supposed to be. And the question is, from the point of view of V1, or the first premise, is what happens between scenario 4, which is still supposedly a case in which composition clearly happens, and scenario N, which is a case in which composition doesn't happen. And it seems like there are only two options, given that in the first case composition happens, and by gradual weakening of the condition in question, composition doesn't happen. It seems like there are only two options. Either there's a sharp cutoff, which means that there are two immediately adjacent cases such that in the first one composition happens and in the second one it doesn't happen. Or there are borderline cases of composition. There are cases somewhere in the middle where it's neither determinately the case that composition happens. It's neither determinately the case, for example, that the handle and the head compose a hammer, nor is it determinately the case that the handle and the head don't compose a hammer. It's borderline. So that's how you get the first premise. If universalism is false, if sometimes composition happens but not always, then that means that either the borderline case of composition or some sharp cutoff. So I'm immediately going to mention the fourth premise, about which I have little to say. That's one of the premises that I'm just going to take for granted. The fourth premise says that the second option is not a real option. There can't be sharp cutoffs about composition. There are no adjacent and almost indistinguishable pairs of cases in which in one of them there is clearly determinately composition and in the other one there isn't. So that means that I'm already assuming, as most proponents but also opponents of the arguments do, that eliminativism about vagueness is false. Arguably, this also counts as assuming that epistemicism about vagueness is false. So epistemicism is the view that vagueness is simply ignorance. There's a clear fact of the matter about how many centimeters tall is tall. Perhaps it's completely determinate that it begins at 184.37 centimeters, but it's just that nobody knows it. So if you had this kind of view about vagueness, then it would be possible to insist that in a sorites series of composition, what's really going on is a sharp cutoff. But most people assume that this is not the case, and I'm going to also assume it. So let's look at the third premise. The third premise says that there cannot be count indeterminacy. So this is a very standard assumption. It says that it cannot be indeterminate how many things, or at least how many concrete things in the world there are. So I'm not going to defend this in detail. All I'm gonna try to do is give you an intuition pump. The intuition pump stems from a famous one-page long paper by Gareth Evans on vague objects. So Evans presented this as an argument. I'm not going to try to reconstruct Evans's argument. It has a huge literature. I'm only going to give you a taste of what motivates this assumption in the form of an intuition pump. So Evans is basically asking, how could there be something such that it's indeterminate whether it exists? Because that's what would seem to be necessary for it to be indeterminate, how many things there are. So how could there, so what does it even mean for it to be indeterminate that a thing exists? That already seems to assume that there is a thing such that it's indeterminate that it exists. But then it's not indeterminate that it exists. Then it just exists, period. So again, I'm not looking to defend this premise. As I mentioned, this one-pager of Evans generated a huge literature. A lot of people push back against his argument. A lot of people think the argument is question-begging. So I deliberately didn't try to give you an argument. I only tried to give you an intuition pump to see why count indeterminacy is thought to be so weird. Relatedly, there's large literature on vague objects, vague identity, whether some coherent, internally coherent logic can be given that can deal with vague identity. All I'm going to say is that I'm just going to assume a very conservative, classic approach to logic and identity, and within that framework, the third premise does look very plausible. In any case, the sort of view I'm going to focus on accepts the third premise. So my main focus is going to be the second premise. The second premise says that if there are borderline cases of composition, then there is count indeterminacy. So let's take a bit of a closer look at this. And here I'm going to closely follow Ted Sider's presentation. So one immediate thing to note is that in general, vague numerical sentences, so sentences that assert that the number of certain things is this or that. So vague sentences of this sort are not by themselves problematic. And the reason for that is that in many or most of these sentences, the vagueness comes from vague constituent expressions other than numerical expressions. So just to give you an example, let's say that I tell you that I had 3 burgers last month. So this sentence can be indeterminate, or it can be a borderline. It can be borderline true whether I had 3 burgers last month. It can be indeterminate whether it's true that I had 3 burgers last month. For no deep metaphysical reasons. It could be the case because the meaning of the word burger is vague. So if, for example, I had 2 Angus beef patties and I also had a chicken patty prepared to taste as similar as possible to a typical burger, then it might be indeterminate if I had 3 burgers, because it's determinate that I had 3 somethings, but it's indeterminate whether the chicken patty was a burger. And there are lots of cases, there are lots of cases like this. Like, it could be indeterminate how many countries there are in the world, because the country status of certain geographical territories is indeterminate. That has nothing to do with numbers. It has nothing to do with metaphysical indeterminacy or anything like that. So one thing to flag is that, in general, numerical sentences that are indeterminate in truth value, that's not in itself a problem. The problem, Sider thinks, is that we can state how many concrete objects there are, how many objects of the sort that the thesis of universalism or candidate theories of composition focus on, without using these expressions that are prone to vagueness. So, burger, country, soldier, these things are all, these expressions are all vague. But we can use very minimal vocabulary to make statements about how many concrete things there are that don't use vague vocabulary. So Sider's example is the sentence, there are exactly 2 concrete things. You can write up this sentence by using only quantifiers, variables, logical connectives like and or, and then the conditional, and the predicate is concrete. So if you look at this formula, it's just a first order. It's just a first order logic rendering of the sentence. They are exactly two concrete things. Sider argues this formula uses the predicate is concrete. Is concrete is not subject to vagueness. It's not just subject to vagueness in the way is a burger or is a country is. And other than that, it uses it's just first order logic. Surely the quantifiers, the identity sign, negation, and these logical connectives, surely they are not subject to vagueness. So he argues, in the case of such a sentence, there's just no other place for the vagueness to be coming from. So if there really is borderline composition, given that we can write up sentence, we can phrase sentences only using this very minimal vocabulary about how many things there are, then counting indeterminacy is unavoidable. We don't have these plausible looking explanations that we have in the case of burgers, for example. So I'm going to stop here for a moment because this is my setup of the argument. I'm now ready to move on to what I take to be my contribution to this debate, but I want to see if there's any question about the setup. Is it clear what kind of argument? Well, I'm not going to attack the argument. I'm going to defend the argument from a certain kind of attack, but is this clear so far? Is there any questions so far just about the setup? Okay, so I'm going to assume that wait, is there? Okay. So I'm going to assume that this is clear so far. So I just mentioned V2.
Just to clarify that there'll be plenty of questions, room for questions at the end of the talk. So if there's anybody who can think of something meanwhile, we'll be happy to rejoin then. Okay.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure that I'm not losing the audience in the first 10 minutes. That's a bad that's a bad time for that to happen. Okay, good. So let me where was I? Okay, so I just mentioned the second premise, which is if there's borderline composition, then there's count indeterminacy. I said this is the premise I'm going to focus on. And indeed, this premise has been subject to a certain kind of criticism. So the criticism comes in many forms. I like to call this criticism, for reasons that I'm going to explain in a moment, the status response. So there's a certain way to attack the second premise. I call this the status response. I'm going to call advocates of the status response statisticians. This is a horrible pun. I'm borrowing it from Nathan Wildman. So he recommended that I call them that, but I think it's a good mnemonic. So the status response says that there can be indeterminate composition without count indeterminacy. Or to give an example, you can actually think of numerical sentences about composite objects much the way that you can think of the source of indeterminacy in the case of I had 3 burgers yesterday. So how is that possible? Again, this kind of response comes in numerous versions. So this is really just the common core that I think we can attribute to them. The common core that all versions of this response have is that whenever it's indeterminate, whether there's a y that the axis compose, this is because there's a determinately existing y. There's a y whose existence is not indeterminate. such that it's indeterminate whether that y has the status that's required for counting as something that's composed by the x's. So I'm going to mention a few versions of this strategy because it's not normally put forth at this level of generality. So one example is eternalism. This is a response to the argument from vagueness given by Lynn Baker in a book that she wrote a few years ago. So Baker adopts eternalism. So eternalism, at least here, is the view that there aren't only present objects, but there are also past and future things. So on this view, it's true, for example, that Socrates exists. It's not just that Socrates existed. Socrates does exist. It's just that Socrates is not present. So Socrates fully exists in the same sense in which you and I exist, but Socrates isn't now present. So that's the eternalist view. So Baker thinks that eternalism helps address the argument from vagueness. So suppose that some x's gradually come from composing a cloud at some time t1 to not composing a cloud at t3. Let's suppose that at t2, it's indeterminate whether the x's compose a cloud. So here's what you can say about this if you're an eternalist. You might think that you might worry that this is a case of borderline composition at T2 and therefore borderline existence, but an eternalist would say, no, if the X is composed the cloud at T1, then it's going to be true at any time that the cloud in question exists. Even at T3, it's true that the cloud exists. It's just that the cloud is no longer present. And similarly at T2, it's determinately true that the cloud exists. It's just that it's no longer determinately true that the cloud is present. So what's really going on, according to Baker, is that there is a cloud at T2. Determinately, there is a cloud at T2. But it's indeterminate whether the x's compose it, because it's indeterminate whether the cloud is present. But this is not vagueness about existence. It's not vagueness. It's also not vagueness about count. It's not some vagueness about cardinality. It's just vagueness about presentness. That's a lot tamer and a lot less problematic than count indeterminacy. So this is one version of the status response. Here's a second version of the status response, supersubstantivalism. This has been defended by Nick Effingham and Daniel Nolan. So supersubstantivalism is the view that every material object is identical to the region of space that it occupies. So supersubstantivalists do accept unoccupied or empty regions of space. It's just that whenever a region of space is occupied, it's just identical to its occupant. So on this kind of view, at least when it's used to answer the argument from vagueness, material objects are concrete things. At least that's Effingham's version of the view, but empty regions aren't. So what happens in this case, according to Effingham, whenever some x's borderline compose an object, there is a spatial region such that it's indeterminate whether the x's compose it. And that's because it's indeterminate whether it's an object. So on this kind of view, in borderline cases of composition, you have a region of space-time, and it's indeterminate whether that region is concrete. It's a borderline concrete region of space, but all of the things that occur in this story either determinately exist or they determinately don't. There isn't anything that is indeterminate existent. There is no counting indeterminacy. You can count the regions of space-time. That's how you get the number of things. Some of these regions of space-time, it's indeterminate whether they are concrete. So that also means that advocates of this response, they actually deny what Sider is assuming here, that the predicate is concrete is a perfectly sharp predicate. So they would already resist the example that Sider is giving here. But this is a second version of the status response. So let me just mention third possible version of the status response. This has been defended by Maureen Donnelly. Similar views have been aired by Catherine Hawley and Chet Carmichael. So on this kind of view, what's vague is the predicate is a part of. So on this kind of view, it can be vague whether there is a composite object in a certain case, because it's vague whether the relation between some x's and some y is the relation of parthood. So on this view, to stick with the example of the cloud, so I said that in a T2, the cloud, it's borderline whether the particles compose a cloud. So what's really going on, according to this version of the status response in the cloud scenario, is that you clearly have an object, you determinately have something at T2. That something bears some kind of a relation to the particles that supposedly compose the cloud. So there clearly are the particles, there clearly is something that may or may not be a cloud. The only thing that's indeterminate is whether the relation that these things bear to the something is composition. So Donnelly, for example, thinks that there are lots of there's a plethora of relations very similar to composition. It's indeterminate which one of them is picked out by the English word composition, and similarly for parthood. Lots of parthood-like relations, but only one of them is picked out by our use of the words parthood. But still, the things whose status as composite objects is in question, they determinately exist. It's just that it's indeterminate whether the relation that the particles bear to them is the relation of composition. So I think you can see a common pattern in all of these responses. They basically all say that in cases of vague composition, these are not cases of existential vagueness. And they're also not cases of count-indeterminacy. They're cases in which you have a determinately existing thing, and the thing's status as a presently existing composite object, that's what's indeterminate. But that's a lot tamer and a lot easier to handle than genuine vagueness about it, vagueness in identity or existence or count-indeterminacy. So what I'm going to do, what I want to do is deploy a kind of general strategy against the status response. So my main complaint against this strategy is that it fails to generalize to entities that aren't objects. So it doesn't avoid count-indeterminacy across the board. So here's how I'm going to do that. First, I'm going to give a specific example when the strategy fails to generalize. This example is admittedly going to be highly controversial, and I'm not expecting you to agree with it. All I want is just for you to see how, if you accept the assumptions that I'm going to make, this is going to be a problem case for the status response. Then I'm going to take a step back and propose 3 criteria that a type of thing must meet to pose a threat to the status response. Then I'm going to quickly mention some further problem cases that satisfy these criteria. My setup of these further cases is going to be a lot more rudimentary than my setup of the first case, because I think by that point it's going to be clear how the strategy that I'm developing is supposed to work. So first, the particular problem case. So I mentioned the cloud case, right? When there's a sorites series of particles or drops of water droplets that at T1 determinately compose a cloud, and by T3 determinately don't compose a cloud. So I want you to focus not on clouds, but on a certain type of event. So here's the events that I have in mind. Suppose that there are some axes that determinately compose a cloud at T1 and borderline compose a cloud at T2. And for simplicity's sake, assume, at least for now, that the axes just stay that way once they borderline compose the clouds. Okay, they never get dispersed more. They never they never come together more. They just stay that way. So question, is there, the question is not about clouds, my question is about events. So is there an event of cloud dispersion between T1 and T2? And just to be perfectly clear, when I'm talking about cloud dispersions, I'm not assuming that anything comes out of existence. Okay, so I'm granting this to advocates of the status response. Maybe an event of cloud dispersion is just a cloud losing its cloud status, maybe, or maybe a cloud ceases to be composite, or something weird like that. So when I'm talking about events of cloud dispersion, I mean to be neutral about the metaphysical status of clouds. So here's what I think the intuitive answer is. If the axes determinatively compose a cloud and determinatively don't at T2, then it's determinate that there's a cloud dispersion. If the axes still determinately compose a cloud at T2, then it's determinate that there is no cloud dispersion. And when it's indeterminate whether the axes compose a cloud at T2, then it's indeterminate whether there's a cloud dispersion. So in the case at hand, when the axes come from determinately composing to borderline composing a cloud, it's indeterminate whether there's a cloud dispersion. But hey, then it's indeterminate whether there's an event. And then it seems that we are back to Kanti-indeterminacy. It's just that this time it's Kanti-indeterminacy about events. So this has been quick, and I'm going to belabor this more, but an immediate worry is that you can quickly generate the same kind of problem that the solution was designed to solve, just this time not with clouds, but with a certain type of event, a cloud dispersion. Okay, so a few questions about this. So one immediate reaction, it's a very natural reaction. Okay, but are vague events as bad as vague objects? A natural thought might be that, look, individuation of events is a lot more problematic and a lot more controversial than the individuation of objects. Maybe if it's indeterminate how many events we have, that's not as bad as indeterminacy about how many objects there are. So I don't agree with this. I think that if you resist positing vague objects, if you resist counting indeterminacy over objects for the reasons that people in this literature usually resist, then you should also resist vague events and counting indeterminacy about events. So I went roughshod through this classic paper of Evans, but following Evans, the reason that people typically don't like counting indeterminacy and vague identity and vague existence is that they usually think that these things are somehow incoherent or unintelligible. Evans clearly thought that indeterminate vague objects are unintelligible. So this is, of course, controversial. So it's controversial whether vague objects or vague existence really is unintelligible. I mentioned already that a lot of pushback has been generated to this famous paper of Evans. My point here is just that if you already believe that vague objects are bad, then all of the reasons that are usually adduced in defense of that claim are equally good reasons to think that vague events are bad. So are vague events as bad as vague objects? The short answer is, if you think vague objects are bad for the usual reasons, then yes, they are just as bad as vague objects. Second worry, which I think is a bit, it's a natural follow-up to the second, is that events feel suspect in a way in which objects aren't. I put this vaguely as, or somewhat generically as well, events are messier than objects. It's still much less clear what events are and how they are individuated. Maybe that's the source of the indeterminacy. Maybe there isn't much of a problem here. Maybe it's indeterminate how many events there are because it's indeterminate how we should count events. So in response, I think we can choose a perfectly sharp, clear a count of events and check for ourselves that it still saddles us with indeterminacy. So here's one example. I propose that we adopt, for the sake of this example, a classic Kimian conception of events. So this is perhaps the most familiar view of events that has been defended by Czech von Kim in a series of papers. So on this view, events are individuated in terms of, sorry about the typo here, in terms of ordered triples of an n tuple of objects, O1 to On, an n-place relation that the objects instantiate. So when there's only one object, then the relation is going to be a monadic property. That's going to be a limiting case of an event with n tuple of objects, and the time at which the objects in question instantiate the events. So on this kind of view, events are basically instantiations of relations by tuples of objects at a time, where that time can be either an instant or an interval. So moreover, I'm also going to assume a sparse conception of properties and relations. So by this I mean that not every predicate corresponds to a property or relation. So the predicate freezes plausibly corresponds to an event of freezing, or the property of freezing, an event of the predicate speeds up corresponds to speeding up. The predicate either turning blue or coming to be loved by Jane, that doesn't correspond to a property. So I'm not going to argue for this. Even though Kim is never explicit about this, I think it's plausible that he meant his properties and relations to be sparse in this sense. I think I don't think he intended for there to be events that merely correspond to Cambridge changes. In any case, it's going to be clear in a moment why I'm assuming this. So let's talk about sparse Kimian events. So I told you that I think if we zone in on this very specific particular conception of events, there's still going to be indeterminacy. We could still generate indeterminacy about the number of events. That should convince us that the indeterminacy in question doesn't simply stem from indecision about what theory of events to accept. So here's a simple scenario. Take some extremely simple word, and a very simple possible word in which its only inhabitants are a bunch of water droplets. Suppose these water droplets pop into existence at T1, immediately form a cloud. So they pop into existence already forming a cloud at T1. Then they come to borderline forming a cloud at T2. And then they immediately pop out of existence. Or even better, they just stay that way till the end of times. They stay frozen in this state of borderline forming a cloud. So in this extremely simple word, I don't think there's any reason to rule out that there are only finitely many events in that word. In the actual word, it might make perfect sense to insist that there are infinitely many events. But in this word, I think it's very plausible that there are only finitely many events. There are just so few things. I also note that this was one reason to assume that properties and relations are sparse. If for any predicate there's a property or relation, then for any way that you can describe what happens in this word, you can just make up yet another separate event. So that's what I wanted to prevent. That's why I'm insisting that the Kimian events that I'm working with here be sparse events. So in this extremely simple word, I think there are only finitely many events, but it's indeterminate how many, because it's indeterminate whether there is an event of cloud dispersion in this very simple possible word. I also want to note, in case this hasn't been clear so far, the reason finity is so important to me, I'm going to get back to this, is that that's how you get count indeterminacy. So if there were infinitely many events, then the difference between one less and one more event when we are already assuming an infinite number of events, that doesn't make a difference for the number. So to get count indeterminacy, to make sure that you have count indeterminacy, that's the bad thing that's supposed to fuel the argument from vagueness. For that, you need at least a possibility of finitely many items. So it looks like these conditions are satisfied here. There are only finitely many events in this super simple word, but it's indeterminate how many. And the indeterminacy doesn't stem from unclarity about how to think about events. I just specified a very specific, highly committal view about what events are. So to generalize a bit, I think that for something to count as a bona fide problem case for the status response, it seems to me that three conditions need to be satisfied. So take some type of thing. So in the previous case, it was events. So take some type of things. First of all, you need that type to be such that at least it's possible for there to be only finitely many things of that type. So I think events satisfy these conditions. Objects, of course, are another case, but that's what the status response was designed to deal with. A second condition is categorical maximality, by which I mean this: there is no broader category T star such that every instance of T is also an instance of T star, but not every instance of T star is an instance of T. So that's the part that is intended to block the status move. You know, the status response could work if you could say that actually it's determinate that there is something, that there is a something between T1 and T2 in the simple word, but it's not determinate that it's an event. It's not determinate that it's a cloud dispersion, but there is a something. It's determinate that it exists. It's just its even status that we don't know. So categorical maximality is supposed to block that. If that's the reason I'm looking for this feature. If a case has this feature, then it blocks this move, which is the crucial move of the status response. And third, I'm looking for things that also meet this condition that I call entailed existence, where the idea is that the same facts that give rise to cases of borderline composition also entail indeterminate cases of T. So for example, if it's indeterminate, how many clouds there are between T1 and T2, then it's also indeterminate how many cloud dispersions occur between T1 and T2. That's the basic idea here. So what I want to say is, I think there are lots of cases that satisfy these three responses. And what I'm going to do now is just mention a few of these. I'm not going to defend them in detail. My strategy at this point is to try to overwhelm you with numbers. And I'm going to try to explain at the end why I think that's a promising strategy, trying to overwhelm with numbers. The first group is what you could call instantiations. So in a way that these are the groups most similar to events. They're groups, they're types of things whose existence is supposed to follow from certain objects satisfying, certain objects instantiating certain properties or relations in a certain pattern. So just to give you a couple of examples, take, for example, Armstrong's states of affairs. So Armstrongian states of affairs are structured compounds that, in his words, are non-mereologically composed out of some individuals and relation. So take some individuals, suppose they borderline instantiate relation R, then it seems that it's indeterminate whether the states of affairs that is a structural compound out of R and A1 to AN exists. So for Armstrong, at least in Armstrong's metaphysics, R needs to be a universal. Armstrong accepted a sparse conception of universals, similarly to my assumption when I was interpreting Kim. So for Armstrong, it's possible at least for there to be finitely many universals. Maybe the actual word is too complex for that, but we can easily cook up simple possible words in which there are finitely many universals. So if you have a possible word with finitely many objects and finitely many universals, you have all the ingredients you need to make sure that there are only finitely many states of affairs. And then you can generate a case when it's going to be indeterminate how many states of affairs there are in that word. And of course, an important assumption here, which is true if you're Armstrong, is that there isn't some higher category to which states of affairs can be absorbed. So there isn't a type of thing such that it's always determinate how many things of that type exist, but the status of some of them as states of affairs is indeterminate. Exact same points apply to tropes. So tropes are particularized properties. For example, not just beardedness, but this particular beardedness of Socrates, or not just redness, but the particular redness of some particular red balloon. So here too, I think you can set up cases very similar to the ones I mentioned with cloudiness tropes. So again, take a cloud that borderline disperses between T1 and T2, then it's going to be indeterminate whether there is a cloudiness trope in T2, and then it's going to be indeterminate how many tropes there are. Again, I'm assuming that it's possible at least for there to be finitely many tropes in the word, even if in the actual word there are infinitely many. So second group is what you could call negative ontology. So holes and shadows belong here. So there are lots of views about holes, and not every view about holes is going to help me set up a problem case of the sort that I want. For our present purposes, assume a kind of realism about holes. So on that sort of view, holes really exist. When an object is properly perforated, there is a further thing over and above the object. The hole, you can set up a sorites series with holes. So for example, you can set up a sorites series of lonely donuts. Imagine a possible world in which there's nothing other than a bunch of donuts floating in empty space. So imagine that in the first word, there is an intact donut, or maybe two intact donuts. In the second word, there's an intact donut and a second donut with a tiny piece bitten off the ring. Still clearly two holes. And in the last word, you have an intact donut and a large U-shaped, but clearly not perforated bakery object. So here too, the idea is somewhere along the line in this sorites series, you're going to have a second donut that is borderline perforated. Maybe the dough bridge that prevents the object from being properly U-shaped is so thin that we wouldn't be sure whether to call it a hole. Okay, I hope you can visualize that. So, you know, when the dough bridge that connects the two parts of the donut is so thin that it's a borderline case of a hole. So in this case too, it looks like you can set up a case in which it's indeterminate how many holes there are. Same kind of experiment can be, thought experiment can be repeated with shadows. So following an 18th century French color scientist, Claude Nicolas Leca. I'm not good at pronouncing French names. So Roy Sorensen talks about shadows as if they are holes in the light. You can set up very similar cases. I'm not gonna go over the details, but you can imagine very simple possible words in which it's gonna be indeterminate how many shadows there are, but there aren't infinitely many shadows. Okay, third example. created abstracta. So actually Dan Corman gave a similar kind of count indeterminacy with created abstracta. So I'm going to take the simplest case, which is the case of a word. So on a certain view about words, words are created artifacts. They come into existence roughly when we start using them. Importantly, they are not just strings of letters. So take, for example, the word irregardless. I'm deliberately using this word because that's a borderline case of a word. I think the community of English speakers is roughly evenly divided over whether there is such a word or not. You know, some of them think this is ungrammatical or unidiomatic. Some of them use it and think it's fine. So it's indeterminate whether a string of Latin letters make up the word irregardless. Words on the view that I'm envisioning don't belong to some broader category. So importantly, the word is not a string of letters on this view because, for example, the word dog didn't exist before it was being used, but the string of letters D-O-G did exist. So you can't absorb words on this view into some broader ontological categories such as string of letters. Again, languages, of course, have a capacity to have infinitely many words, but as a matter of fact, they don't. As a matter of fact, they contain infinitely many words. So it can easily be, you know, even if you don't agree with that, surely there's a possible world in which English is simpler than it actually is, and suppose there isn't any other natural language being spoken. So in that kind of a word, even if not in the actual word, you can clearly set up a scenario when it's just indeterminate how many words there are. Because it's indeterminate whether there is such a word as irregardless, for example. So there are more cases. Why did I just do that? Why did I give lots of different kinds of examples where essentially the same strategy can be employed without really defending them in detail? So I'm fully aware that each of these cases rely on highly controversial views. So, you know, it's not mandatory to be an Armstrongian about states of affairs. A lot of people don't believe in tropes. A lot of people are not realists about wholes. Sorensen's account of shadows is obviously not the sole candidate on the scene. There are plenty of other views of words other than the one that I appeal to by Ermak and also Corman, which wouldn't generate this problem. So, you know, isn't it a problem that I was relying on these totally specific, you know, very specific and pretty controversial views? I don't think so, because the more such cases we have, the more problematic it's going to be for statisticians to simply reject them. So for any individual case, like created artifacts account of words, of course, the statistician could always say, well, I reject that account. After I gave you so many cases, it's going to be increasingly problematic for the statistician to give that response, because you know, if he needs to do that to resist all of these problem cases, then the statistician will end up with a very baroque and increasingly arbitrary looking set of theoretical commitments. You know, he's going to be committed to, or rather against, a whole swath of views in various distant areas of metaphysics that we probably wouldn't have thought have anything to do with the metaphysics of composition. So I do think, even though I didn't give a conclusive, I don't pretend to have given a conclusive refutation of the statist response, I do think that I managed to put quite a lot of pressure on it. The view doesn't generalize to a whole bunch of other sources of Kant indeterminacy. These sources are easily generated when you accept certain kinds of usable events, tropes, states of affairs, shadows, holes, and created artifacts. The more of these you need to reject in a piecemeal way, the less united your theory is going to look. And I also want to note that other responses to the arguments from vagueness don't have this problem. So I mentioned, for example, this rejection of eliminativism or epistemicism about vagueness. If you do accept that, you can, of course, use the same strategy to deal with the problem cases I mentioned. I also mentioned that Evans on ontic indeterminacy is highly controversial. Some people do accept indeterminate or vague identity. Again, if you do that, it's also going to deal with my problem cases. So I think this is a significant drawback of the status response. It exploits features that are highly specific to composite objects, which also means that it's not going to generate very similar problem cases, not about composite objects. And that's about it. Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to see what you think and what questions you're going to raise about this.
David, thank you so much. I should say that whenever I wonder about the chances of analytic metaphysics or its tenor nowadays, I talk to David, and again, I'm optimistic. This is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. And we are going to have a Q&A now. I should kindly ask everyone who'd like to ask a question to please sign up in the chat. And we'll see what comes by here. Let's just take a deep breath in and then breathe out, and thank David for a fantastic talk. Lots of moving pieces, David. And this is just terrific because if anything, we should be able to reason hypothetically as natural sort of human beings. So even if somebody sort of differs from the endpoint that you reach, they should be able to appreciate that it's quite a feat to reach it from your premises. So I just wonder, is there any question right now, or should I just abuse my privilege? Okay, done. Perfect. Done. We're all ears. We're listening.
Hi. Hello.
Hey. Hey.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm very far from being a metaphysician, so I'm not really sure what I'm saying at all. But so I have maybe some musings about the third condition that you mentioned, that you called entailed existence, and that is the same facts that give rise to cases of borderline composition also entailed identity indeterminacy cases of T, right? And I'm just wondering, so that seems to be the crucial bit in all your, I mean, in the dialectics. If you have that, and I guess the cases that you presented are of that sort, then you basically, you basically won the game in a way. So that kind of condition seems to me to be very, I mean, that seems to be the core condition, the other two conditions that you mentioned. But on the other hand, because you mentioned here, so you gave an example of cloud dispersion, and that seemed nice. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what to think about that, but does that? So here you mentioned borderline composition, but it wasn't clear to me whether. So here you seem like compare now the condition you gave and the way you described it, and the case of cloud dispersion. You seem to still, when you formulate entailed existence as you did, you still seem to be kind of thinking about objects and the way they compose. And the point of the cloud, the point of the cloud dispersion example was like, well, there's other things in the world except objects, and it's bad if they're indeterminate and so on and so forth. So I wasn't sure whether there's a tension here, or maybe like the example and this third condition kind of apply to different things. And if you can thanks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think you're pointing at something important, and it's also something that I should have said a few more sentences about this third condition, because the way I'm employing it is a little bit less straightforward than I made it out in the talk, because I didn't want to complicate the flow even more. But I'm very glad that you asked about it. So the reason, so at least I think at least in the cloud case, but also maybe somewhat less obvious than the horse case and in the shadow case. I think the anti-element is relatively straightforward, because these things, shadows and also clouds and holes, these are usually thought to depend on or be parasitic on ordinary material objects. So maybe this is the clearest in the case of a shadow. When do you have a cloud? You have a cloud when the particles compose a cloud. The relation is a bit less straightforward in the case of holes, because holes themselves are not composed, but it's still reasonably clear that it's the arrangement of some very small material objects that settle whether there's a hole in a certain case. I think the case in which you might think that this condition is not satisfied is in the last group of examples of abstract artifacts, because it doesn't seem, at least on the face of it, that composition has anything to do with what words we have. Words are, at least on this view, they are abstract objects. They're not in space. They don't depend on how matter is arranged, really. So what I want to say, and I do admit that this was quick, what I want to say is, so if you look at how I formulated this third condition, is this visible now? So the same facts that give rise to cases of borderline composition also entail indeterminate cases of T. So I really meant entail strictly and literally in the sense of just classical entailment. Not grounding, not explanation, not it's because of the first that you have the second. So, in a way I'm cheating a little bit, because in the abstract artifacts case, I still think it's true that borderline composition entails indeterminate cases of abstract artifacts, but that's just because it's necessary that there could be indeterminate cases of abstract artifacts. It doesn't actually have anything to do with borderline composition. Right. So for this reason, I actually think that the third condition is in a way less important than the other two. Strictly speaking, I could get away with, I could set up my case with cases that, they're entailed by borderline composition, but they don't really depend, the plausibility doesn't depend on borderline composition. In the cases when the anti-element is not vacuous, it's not from zero premises, so to speak. I think that gives more of, it gives more of a rhetorical backing for the kind of revenge case that I want to set up. But I think you're totally right that the relation between borderline composition and some of these other cases is not at all straightforward. And in some cases, it's really just entailment and nothing more. No explanatory connection or dependence or anything like that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that helps. That helps a lot, actually. And just to see things clear, in the case of cloud dispersion, so what are the facts that are entailing whatever other things? Just the, whatever the movement of the particles or some such, or whatever the clouds are made of.
Yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it. I mean, maybe I should say, and maybe I also should have made that more explicit. I don't have in mind logical entailment. I just have in mind metaphysical entailment. Mm-hmm. Really, a very strong form of supervenience.
Okay.
If the particles are arranged in such and such a way, then it's also gonna be indeterminate whether you have a cloud dispersion. That's the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks.
So, David, once again, fantastic. I'm just going to butt in for a second and ask anybody else who has another question to wait in line, and hopefully they'll sort of flag this in the chat. But I actually have a couple of questions, but I'm just going to ask the first one first. And the first one is really sort of, flat-footed, okay? And it's this. I wonder if there are any sort of purely formal treatments of this. And this is not necessarily metaphysically committal, but it's sort of logically or mathematically explicit. And I ask this because it seems to me that there are so many moving pieces. So, for instance, there's possible indeterminacy with respect to count. Okay, so there might be a question, if I think of myself and myself minus my nose, and I know there's a famous analytic metaphysician who's discussed this issue, and that's David Kovacs. Is there one of me, or there are two of me, right? And that would be different. Or is there something in between, which would be awkward, right? Neither one nor two. So indeterminacy is going to differ from vagueness to some extent, and it might help clarifying that issue, right? But there are other issues as well. So, for instance, if I say, look, there might be some kind of difference in degree. Okay, let's just be neutral about this. Difference in degree with respect to existence. Something exists more or less. Difference in degree with respect to presentness. Something is more or less present. Difference in degree with respect to property instantiation. Something more or less instantiates a property. Difference in degree with respect to property collocation, right? So two properties might more or less overlap, as it were, in space. Difference in degree with respect to object. I look at some crazy scatter and I wonder, is that really an object or not? Right? Difference in degree with respect to what was it that you mentioned? So there are a number of others of other things that could vary in degrees. Right? And it seemed to me that some of these issues are going to very quickly be convoluted. So, for instance, if we talk about, if we distinguish between, take the eternalist response, for instance, right? If we're going to distinguish between existence tout court and existence now, right? Then clearly we could distinguish between collocation or coinstantiation tout court and collocation or coinstantiation in the present moment, right? And so when you sort of seep the case, when you undermine the case for count indeterminacy, given the existence or non-existence of borderline cases, then we can discuss borderline too, whether that's a precise or vague concept itself. So when that dialectic is in the background, all of a sudden we ask ourselves, wait a minute, are we talking about count indeterminacy eternally or in the present? Are we talking about count indeterminacy with respect to property or with respect to a pair of properties that may or may not be partially overlapping, partially collocated, partially, etc.? And would that be partially collocated in the present moment or in the absolute? And so everything all of a sudden gets to be much funnier. Right?
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder, is there a purely formal treatment of this, or should we sort of balance out somehow the theoretical metaphysical treatments with our intuitions and hope for the best?
I mean, what you just said, your last sentence just perfectly summarizes how I like approaching all of these issues. As you know, we start with some intuitions and mix and mash and see in what combination they are incoherent, and we try to revise them in the most conservative way possible. I'm very sympathetic to that approach. I mean, many of my colleagues are super hostile to it, but I think that's the way to go. Now, as to your question, so a lot of the things that you mentioned, I wouldn't say all of them, but a lot of the things that you mentioned definitely come up in this debate. And I would say that some of them also have, I don't know what counts as purely formal, but some of them have very technically sophisticated treatments. So there's a big literature on degree theoretic approaches to vagueness, which recognizes degrees of truth or degrees of truthiness. So in that kind of view, you can you basically adopt a many-valued logic in which indeterminate sentences get a truth value somewhere between 0 and 1. It could be anywhere. I guess you could combine it to degrees of existence. So Chris McDaniel has recently defended a view on which existence is something that comes in degrees. His own treatment wasn't formal, but I no doubt that if it's not out there yet, it's only a matter of time when that's going to come too.
Right.
Some kind of it. So a lot of these approaches are well and alive, and have been presented at a very high level of technical sophistication. The kind of approach that I am criticizing here, one of its major sexy features is that it doesn't do any of those things. That's supposed to be the attraction. That it's it adopts some quirky metaphysics in any implementation, but it sticks with the most mainstream views imaginable of the formal aspects. It can stick with classical logic. It doesn't need to adopt degrees of truth. I didn't really get into supervaluationism about vagueness, but a highly popular approach to vagueness is a kind of supervaluationist treatment. One way to present the argument from vagueness, which I avoided here because that's not really the issue that is in the focus in the sub-debate that I've been trying to enter. But one way to present the argument from vagueness is that you can't handle vagueness about the number of objects in this supervaluationist way that people like to adopt as a general approach to vagueness. Very briefly, because the way Sider put it, there don't seem to be anything that are plausible precisifications of quantifier expressions, and there's nothing else for there to be vague. So this approach, of course, is consistent with the supervaluationist treatment because, for example, you can say that actually partude is vague. The word partude is vague. There's partude 1 and partude 2 and partude n, and these are the precisifications of partude, and that's the source of vagueness in these statements. Or if it's not partude, it's going to be something else, like is concrete, contracider, like the borderline case of concreteness, and there are indeed precisifications of concreteness. So the short answer is there are the approaches that you mentioned, and I on any other day I take them seriously. The main hot feature of the staticist response is that despite the quirky metaphysics, when it comes to the logical and the formal aspects, it's as conservative as it gets. So anyone who's attracted to conservatism about these issues and classical logic and bivalence and things like that. Anyone like that should be quite attracted, at least on the face of it, to the status response. I hope I answered your question, but that's why I see a connection.
So you did, but in doing so, you also made it a much nicer question and much deeper question, because I had initially imagined, I had initially imagined we wouldn't need to appeal to degrees of truth or to changing quantifier rules in any ways, but maybe we could. I mean, that's a possibility. But I noticed that there's another participant who has a question. So, Alex, we're all ears.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the presentation. For me, I'm a first-year student, so it's still something new, but it's really interesting. My question would be, in metaphysics, you always use a certain language, some kind of meta language. Like in your case, you have terms like artifacts and objects and events and instantiations. When you are trying to criticize, for example, that language, how would you go about doing that? By creating another meta language that goes on top of that in order to criticize those terms? Because if you do that, you could arrive at something like the third man argument in Plato, like to go ad absurdum, creating new terms that encompass existing ones in order to somehow criticize them.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I haven't thought very deeply about how I would criticize an entire framework like that. But yeah, I suppose if I wanted to criticize the very notion of an event as it's usually employed, I would need to make some kind of a meta language, meta-linguistic ascent. So that, yeah, I guess that seems right to me. I do want to flag, though, that at least it wasn't, maybe I inadvertently did that, but it wasn't my intention to criticize the concepts, the concept of an event or the concept of a whole. I'm perfectly happy with those pieces of language or those pieces of ideology. I just took specific metaphysical theories of these things and tried to plug them into the status response. But I wasn't at least I wasn't meaning to do anything that has to do with language or linguistic frameworks or anything like that. I was doing the naive medieval metaphysicians thing and just trying to dive straight into the ontology.
And let me just butt in and add to. I mean, David really gave the fantastic answer here, and let me just sort of add a bit to it. So if, say, an atheist and a believer both talk about redemption, in a sense, they might be using the same concept and giving two very different theories of it, right? In a different sense, they might be proposing two very different concepts and then sort of talking past each other, right? Similarly here, right? But when it comes to Alex's question, there's also this thing, right? When it comes to the third man argument and Parmenides, there seems to be some kind of obscure suggestion that there's a regress argument going on. And if so, let's see it spelled out, right? But even so, well, suppose there's a regress. What's wrong with that? And then see that spelled out as well. I very much like the fact that Alex mentioned this idea of object language, meta language, and then there's a whole hierarchy of languages, sort of Tarski style, right, where this goes on transfinitely. And there's a question, right, of how that is supposed to tally with the metaphysical issues being debated, because metaphysics, we're told, is about reality. And reality isn't about a whole hierarchy of languages. It's about the world, right? And so a fantastic question, Alex. Thanks for bringing this up. And there are a host of incredibly interesting issues. And I mean, thanks for.
Can I mention something? I mean, if there are other questions, I'm happy to answer them first. But now that you brought up regresses, I did want to quickly say something, because maybe I missed. There's something in the vicinity of Alex's question that does bug me. And if I can say just 2 sentences about that.
Please do.
So I do think, I'm going back and forth about this, but on some days of the week, I do think that there's a regress issue, not for my view, but for the view that I'm criticizing. So if you look at the slide, I have this criterion of categorical maximality, right? There's no broader category such that every T is a T star, but not every T star is a T, right? So statisticians try to absorb objects to spatial regions, for example, or presently existing objects to just existing objects. It's the same move in many different implementations. So I did have an earlier version of the paper trying to play a sort of regress argument on this, where the idea is that whatever higher or more general ontological category they want to absorb, the problematic things, why can't I set up a sorites series with that category? At least in some cases that seems plausible, and eventually you're bound to bottom out with an ontological category that's just bottom level, or top level, depending on how you visualize that. So I'm going to flag, I'm intrigued by this argument. I carried out because I wasn't able to formulate it in a way that I find satisfying. But I'm going back and forth. Maybe there's a cool point to be made there, and I'm glad that Alex reminded me of that. That's something I haven't really made up my mind about. But yeah, there might be something there. I'm inclined to agree.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. And just before I budge in again, I just wonder if there are some other questions that are maybe not from me. So let's see. Anyone else in the meeting? Don, would you have some further questions? I know you have a bunch of questions, so if you do.
No, sorry, not this time.
Okay.
I actually have to go. I'm really sorry, but thanks a lot, David and Andre, for putting this up.
Well, thanks.
I appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you. And I see that Alex has some more questions. So Alex, please go ahead.
One more question. Let's say that someone would come up with a metaphysical system that contradicts yours. How can you establish a line of communication between different metaphysical systems?
Oh, I mean, that's such a big question. I'm not sure. I don't have some big general magic formula. I would try to see if there's any assumption that we agree on. I mean, if we don't agree on anything and we can't even live with the same concepts, I'm somewhat skeptical that it's going to be possible. It's a good deep question, but it's too deep for me to have any big, if I had a convincing systematic response to this, I would probably be famous.
Thanks. That's a great question and a terrific answer. Although, David, if you ask me, I just think it's a question of time. But okay, so here's another question. If we go back to V2, right?
All right. Yeah.
So suppose we did that, and this is way sort of early, right? Okay. If borderline composition is a thing, then count indeterminacy is a thing, right? And there's a status answer to this. And the status answer obviously is to deny V2, right? And the V2 is a conditional. So it's false when the antecedent's true and the consequence false.
Yeah.
Right? And you are going to undermine, right, the status answer to V2, right? So what are you going to do? Are you endorsing V2? Are you going ahead and endorsing the argument for universal composition? So what's the larger scheme of things here?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I don't have a very firm position on the argument from vagueness. This argument has been attacked in so many different ways. I mean, it's kind of silly to say this, but this argument has been criticized so much in so many different ways that it's a bit hard for me to imagine that there really isn't any problem with it. So for now at least, my ambitions are fairly modest. I'm hoping that we can make some very modest progress in seeing that of the many problems that have been raised for the argument, this is not one of them. I mean, I'm sympathetic to universalism for what it's worth. I think it has great problem-solving capacity. I kind of need it, or at least something close to it, for some of my preferred views to work. So I would certainly be pleased if this argument was sound, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about it because I haven't studied the other premises as closely. I mean, at some point, it boils down to a matter of judgment. I mean, are vague. So I think a good example is, is there any problem with vague identity and vague objects?
And there's a huge questions. Is that right?
Say it again.
And those are two different questions.
So yeah, I think those are two different questions. They're often lumped together. So Evans gave what he presented as a straightforward argument against vague objects. There's been an explosion of this literature since Evans.
Just to quip in one thing, right here at UB, Graham Priest was giving a talk, I think it was last September or something like that. And he was saying, look, we can cook up a logical system plus the predicate of identity, whereby what Evans is saying is just nonsense. And we can also cook up a logical system plus the predicate of identity, whereby what Evans is saying makes perfect sense. And so Priest was just peddling, if I remember correctly, a pluralistic line, right?
Yeah. So that's a view. So I think the logical space of options here is I mean, you never say it's over, but it's very, very thoroughly covered by now. I'm sure you know that Ross Cameron and Elizabeth Barnes worked extensively on this issue, on how to make sense of ontic vagueness, and they have their own. Barnes especially, she has her own spin on this. So at this point, I'm very skeptical I'm very skeptical of refutations in this area of the sort that Evans tried to attempt, which start with incontrovertible premises and show that a certain concept being employed is incoherent. I don't think that can be done. So in that sense, I think if you don't want to be a universalist, you don't have to be a universalist. So in that sense, I don't think that.
I mean, isn't this in a way a bit like the crazy grandpa? And you know, the crazy grandpa is crazy, but then which view are you going to take that's going to differ from that? And there's a host of other views, right?
Right. So I think, yeah, so it's similar to what I was going to say. So, you know, I think my short answer is, to me, the premises of this argument look plausible. They're not incontrovertible. If you don't want to accept the conclusion, you have plenty of options. But to me, the premises look fairly plausible. The conclusion itself looks fairly plausible to me. I think universalism, in conjunction with a few other views, is a very powerful package with a lot of problem-solving potential. You know, my approach to metaphysics is much closer to David Lewis's than to Spinoza's. I think it's negotiation on the market and trying to get the lowest price. And I think this argument goes a long way to that. So I think that's my short answer. That yeah, I like this argument. I don't think it's conclusive. I think there are very few conclusive arguments in philosophy. Maybe it's a bit of a letdown, but yeah.
Yeah, that's just terrific. So lots of food for thought here. David Kovacs, Tel Aviv, a fantastic opening into topics in analytic metaphysics that we should all be eager to explore further. And thank you so much, David. And looking forward to hearing from you again and to talking and chatting private and also to more talks from you. So thanks so much.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this really fun Q&A. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.